The good news for us is we got Bloomberg intelligence people down in D.C., and their job is to figure out what's going to happen in D.C., in Congress, and how's it going to impact various industries and various markets. We actually pay them to do this stuff, and they're really, really good at it. Nathan Dean is our go-to person on all things Washington. He makes sense out of it all. Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst, joins us here. Hey, Nathan, I'm sure you're getting this question 1,000 times a day. What will a Harris administration look like, and what will a Trump administration look like across basically everything, and how will it impact the markets? How do you kind of synthesize that question to our clients?
Yeah, so I think we're saying that there's 4, maybe 5 key themes. Let's go with 5 for next year in terms of a Harris or a Trump presidency. And you can see where both presidencies are going to have to play out in these themes. The first is, like you just mentioned, tariffs. Now, we have a 70% chance of tariffs coming no matter what next year. It's just whether or not they are a broad tariff, like 60% on all goods coming from China, or a subsector tariff like what we've seen in the Biden administration with on automobiles, for example. Tariffs are somewhat popular, so tariffs are coming. The second is tax. The Trump-era tax cuts expires at the end of 2025 for individuals. So we're going to see a robust tax debate. And specifically, you're going to see a debate on whether or not that corporate tax rate changes from 21% to something else to help pay for these tax cuts. You're going to see a regulation effort or a deregulation effort, depending on who you are. This is certainly important to the investment banks. You're going to see the debt ceiling return probably in the second to third quarter next year. You're going to see a debt ceiling fight if Kamala Harris wins the presidency. And finally, a lot of people have questions on the Inflation Reduction Act because there's a lot of CapEx coming into the United States on renewable industry, for example. Will the IRA either be cemented under Harris presidency or tweaked or altered to help pay for those tax cuts under a Trump presidency?
For banks, I go right to the capital requirements under Basel III. How do the candidates stand on that, and how would that impact the sector?
Yeah, so you're talking about the Basel III endgame. It's a proposed rule which, if outlined as by the Fed, would increase capital requirements for the American G-SIBs. So think of the Bank of Americas, the JP Morgans, and the Citigroups, around 9%. You're looking at around a 3 to 4% increase in terms of the mid-sized regionals like PNC Truist. Now, if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, we think this proposal will be reproposed in the early part of next year, and they'll try and finalize it towards the end of 2025, maybe the beginning of 2026, and then implementation would begin the next 3 years after that, or over the next 3 years. If President Trump wins, I think you're going to see the work on this just stop. And I don't think these capital requirements are ever going to be implemented, at least not within the next few years. And this is where it could actually turn global in terms of its impact. The European regulators have already implemented this. They call it Basel IV. It's already been implemented. And we've seen steps, for example, in the UK for the UK regulators to delay the implementation because they're concerned the Americans are never going to follow suit. So if the American regulators say, no, we're not going to move forward with the Basel III endgame under the Trump presidency, you could see the potential start of a global race to the bottom in terms of capital as Europe begins to actually pull back some of their stuff as well.
Nathan, you're down there in D.C. You're knee deep in this stuff, and I know you got great sources down there. Is there any consensus to how Congress may play out in this election, or House is flipping? Are they staying the same, or are we going to have a split type of thing? Is there any consensus?
Yeah, so I think most Washingtonians think that the Republicans have a really good shot of taking the Senate. And the reason being is that this is not a good race for the Democrats. They're defending 23 against 34 in states in total. And with Senator Joe Manchin retiring in West Virginia, most likely going to replace him with a Republican, the Democrats are essentially going to have to run the gauntlet and have a really good night in order to keep the Senate. Now, why do we care about this? Because the Senate there's a filibuster in the Senate for legislation. There's no filibuster for nominations. So if Kamala Harris wins and the Senate Republicans take the Senate, they'll effectively be able to jam a lot of her nominees, a lot of her regulatory leadership in place for the first half of the year. If President Trump wins, he's going to be able to get a lot of his nominees in place and be able to move much quicker on a deregulatory effort. Now, when it comes to the House, polling is a little bit more difficult. It's extremely tight. Our general thought is that whoever wins the presidency will most likely win the House. And the reason why investors should care about who wins the House is because of the tax debate that I mentioned next year. Tax policy historically starts in the House. So whoever controls the House Ways and Means Committee, and therefore controls a very important person in Washington who's going to decide what those tax negotiations will look like next year.
Can I just jump back to some of the sectors, specifically with electric vehicles? Harris, they would support subsidies for electric vehicles or tax breaks, which I find curious because Elon Musk is the guy stumping for Donald Trump at this point, and he stands to be, well, Tesla stands to be impacted quite a bit by this.
Yeah, we've heard anecdotally that, because Tesla, the Tesla vehicle is pretty expensive. And so whether or not a $7,500 tax credit would change the buying habits over Tesla, I've been talking to our autos analyst, Steve Mann, about this quite a bit. So there's some thought out there that Tesla is somewhat protected. We've also seen through Steve's work that some of the other automakers are looking to try and put out low-cost EVs as a way to combat that. But the reason why the EV tax credit is so important is because it's part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And if you're going to try and figure out how to pay for $3.5–4 trillion worth of tax cuts to extend those, the IRA is certainly something they're going to be looking at. Now, I think the IRA, for most part, is going to be cemented. It's really popular in Republican states in terms of that CapEx that's coming in and building plants. But that EV tax credit is one of those provisions that could potentially be on the chopping block to help pay for those tax cuts.
John, if I were elected president, my first phone call would be, get this Nathan Dean guy in my White House just to get stuff done. He knows everything, and I feel like he knows everybody, and he just explains stuff so well and just gets stuff done.
Why isn't anybody talking about the fiscal deficits at this point? Because I guess it's just, it's just
it's
impolite.
not good politics.
They're not popular.
It's not good politics. All right, hey Nathan, thanks so much for joining us. As always, Nathan Dean. We're going to be tapping into him basically on a daily basis going forward. Nathan Dean.